Hello, and welcome. Thanks for being here tonight as we take a trip back to the 17th century. The age of windmills, wooden shoes, and diseased flowers that caused an outbreak of unexplainable hysteria. Though technically true, I might have misled you a little with that last part. But you'll understand soon enough. If the rain you hear now isn't enough, turn on a fan for even more of that soft background noise. And relax as you learn and rest. Let's start with a country that had everything figured out. A booming economy, global trade dominance, incredible art, and an all-consuming obsession with tulips. Because apparently when a society gets too wealthy too fast, it doesn't invent something useful. It invents a flower-based financial crisis. 17th century Netherlands was the place to be. The Dutch Republic was a superpower. Their ships ruled the seas. Their merchants were trading spices, silk, porcelain, basically everything exotic that rich Europeans could throw money at. Amsterdam was a hub of capitalism, banking, and colonialism, neatly packaged in a network of canals and self-satisfied merchants in lace collars. They didn't just have money, they had systems. This is the place that pioneered the stock market. The Dutch East India Company was the first publicly traded corporation. And the people, oh, they were clever, educated, sophisticated, which makes what happened next even more incredible. Enter the tulip. It wasn't even Dutch, it came from the Ottoman Empire, part of the loot of international botanical trade. But when tulips arrived in Europe, they didn't just catch on. They caused a frenzy. The flowers were elegant, symmetrical, dramatic, unlike anything in European gardens. They bloomed in deep reds, yellows, purples, and if you were really lucky, you got a broken tulip, one infected with a virus that gave it multicolored streaks and flames. At the time, nobody understood what caused this. All they saw was a flower that looked like it had been individually airbrushed by God. Naturally, they were expensive. At first, tulips were for the elite. Wealthy collectors cultivated them in greenhouses, compared patterns like jewelers inspecting rare diamonds, and gave them names like Admiral van der Eyck and General van der Meren, because of course they did. Tulip ownership became a symbol of sophistication, a way of saying, I have so much disposable income, I can spend it on a plant that might die before the week is out. But this wasn't just gardening, it was flexing. Portraits from the time show smug Dutch merchants posing next to a single tulip in a pot, like it's the Holy Grail. They hired painters to immortalize their prized bulbs, not the actual flower, the bulb. These people were commissioning oil paintings for root vegetables. So tulips were luxury items. But then something changed. Prices started rising. Not just a little, a lot. Because demand was outpacing supply. And tulips, biologically speaking, are slow. You can't just mass produce them. It takes years for tulips to mature from seeds, and even then, only some would develop the fancy, broken streaks everyone wanted. They were rare, unpredictable, and delicate. In other words, perfect for speculation. And once people realized they could flip a tulip bulb for 10 times what they paid, it was off to the races. Tulips went from a hobby of the rich to a full-blown commodity. The early tulip trade was still among the well-to-do: doctors, lawyers, merchants. But as word spread that tulip bulbs were making people rich, the middle class wanted in. Artisans, bakers, barbers, everyone started buying bulbs, not to plant them or admire them, but to resell them at a profit. The tulip market took off. Specialized exchanges were set up. People bought and sold tulips not by digging them up, but by trading contracts, promises to deliver a bulb at some future date. It was essentially futures trading, hundreds of years before Wall Street made it official. And these contracts changed hands over and over before a single bulb ever saw sunlight. People weren't trading tulips anymore. They were trading bets on tulips. And like all great bubbles, it made perfect sense until it didn't. Some bulbs were changing hands 20 or 30 times in a single season. Everyone believed the price would keep rising. And for a while, they were right. Prices doubled in days. Entire fortunes were made in months. People were quitting jobs to trade tulip contracts at bars. Taverns became makeshift trading floors. A single bulb of a rare variety could be worth more than a skilled worker earned in a decade. One record shows a bulb traded for a full wagon of grain, a complete set of clothes, a silver cup, and 12 sheep. It sounds like a joke. It was not a joke. And no one wanted to be left out. The logic was simple. If prices are going up, buy now, sell later. Don't worry about the product. Don't worry about what happens if it goes down. That's a future you problem. Today, you're on your way to early retirement thanks to speculative botany. Now let's pause here. These were not stupid people. They were literate, numerate, well-informed. They read newspapers. They kept ledgers. They lived in the most economically advanced country in Europe, and they were pouring their life savings into underground root vegetables based on rumor, envy, and pure FOMO. This wasn't rational. It was social contagion, dressed up as smart investing. And the further it spread, the dumber it got. People were taking out loans to buy tulips. Others were bartering possessions, trading furniture, livestock, even their homes. It didn't matter what you gave up. What mattered was getting in before prices went even higher. Because everyone had a story about someone who bought low and sold high. Never mind that no one was cashing out. And so, by the winter of 1636, the Dutch Republic was in full tulip frenzy. The entire market was running on pure speculation. There were no fundamentals, no earnings, no dividends, just the collective belief that someone would always be willing to pay more. For now. But the laws of economic gravity don't care about optimism. Eventually, reality knocks on the door. The problem is, by the time it does, everyone's too over-leveraged to answer. And that's where we're heading next. By the mid-1600s, tulips had become more than just flowers. They were fashion, they were taste, they were power. In the way that a Rolex doesn't just tell time, tulips didn't just bloom. They announced that you'd made it. At first, only the elite had access. You didn't stumble across rare tulip varieties in a village garden. These flowers were grown in tightly controlled conditions by well-funded horticulturists, studied by academics and whispered about at merchant parties. They were hoarded, cultivated, named like royalty, and shown off with a smugness typically reserved for oil paintings and gold-plated goblets. Tulips were exotic. They were difficult to grow. They came from a far-off land, namely the Ottoman Empire, which gave them that mystical, luxurious edge. Europeans had no idea what made them so colorful, especially the ones that burst into stripes, flames, and unusual patterns. And that mystery made them more valuable. No two were exactly alike. The rarest ones were unpredictable, and in a culture obsessed with uniqueness and collection, that made them irresistible. The creme de la creme was the broken tulip, so called because of the way its colors broke like dazzling, flame-like streaks. These weren't just rare, they were almost impossible to replicate on purpose. A bulb might bloom plain one year and spectacular the next, or it might never do anything special again. It was gambling with flowers, and that was the appeal. Exclusivity with a side of chaos. What no one knew was that these patterns were caused by a virus, the tulip-breaking virus, now known to be a type of mosaic virus that messes with the pigmentation in the flower cells. But in the 1600s, virology wasn't exactly on the radar. Instead, these broken tulips were treated like divine anomalies, floral miracles. The more dramatic the stripes and flames, the more valuable the bulb. And these weren't casual price bumps. We're talking exponential jumps in value just for a bit of red splashed onto a yellow petal. Tulips started to be classified by color, bloom time, shape, and most importantly, rarity. Catalogs were printed, actual professional listings of different bulbs with names, descriptions, and prices. It was like Pokemon cards, but you needed a greenhouse and a healthy bank account to play. Some of these catalogs looked more like fine art books. They had watercolors of each tulip lovingly painted to show off the precise streaks and hues. Collectors would flip through them like auction guides, selecting bulbs the way a modern collector might flip through a watch magazine, casually hunting for something completely impractical and wildly expensive. The names were absurdly grand. Admiral of Admirals, Emperor of Constantinople, viceroy. These weren't flowers, they were royalty, and people treated them accordingly. To own a Semper Augustus, one of the most famous broken tulips, was to broadcast your financial and social supremacy without uttering a word. Having one of these bulbs in your garden was like parking a rare Ferrari in front of your house with the keys dangling from the side mirror. You didn't even have to drive it. You just had to let people see it. And that's what tulips became. Visible wealth. The kind that whispered in the right ears and screamed in the wrong ones. They were discussed in letters between merchants. They were written into wills. They were displayed at gatherings with just the right lighting and just the right guests to admire them. A carefully cultivated tulip bed in Amsterdam could be as much a symbol of success as a mansion or a noble title. That wasn't just vanity, it was strategic. In a society built on trade and reputation, showing taste and wealth through rare tulip collection was a way to signal you were part of the economic and cultural elite. You didn't just know how to make money, you knew how to spend it. Tulips also started appearing in art, not as background detail, but as the centerpiece. Dutch still lifes began to feature vases overflowing with tulips, each painted with forensic precision. These paintings weren't just pretty, they were advertisements, coded messages about wealth, sophistication, and the owner's place in the social hierarchy. By the late 1630s, there were guilds of growers and traders. Specialized horticulturists kept detailed records of each bulb's lineage. And as more varieties emerged, prices climbed higher, especially for the ones with no known duplicates, the true unicorn bulbs. These weren't just flowers anymore. They were investments, trophies, even heirlooms. They passed through generations, traded among wealthy families, insured against loss, and in some cases, used as collateral. And all of this, the catalogs, the paintings, the formal naming, the coded status, was happening before the true market bubble took off. This wasn't yet speculation. This was simply what happens when exclusivity, aesthetics, and absurd amounts of disposable wealth collide. Tulips didn't become popular because they were practical or edible or useful. They became popular because they were just out of reach, and that made people want them more. The irony, of course, is that for all the science and prestige wrapped around tulip cultivation, the key to their value was randomness. That virus, it couldn't be controlled. Growers would spend years trying to replicate a broken tulip and fail spectacularly. Some bulbs would bloom brilliantly once, then fade into mediocrity. Others would take years to show any pattern at all. It was a floral lottery, and only the lucky hit the jackpot. Which in hindsight should have been a red flag. Because when a market is driven not by fundamentals but by mystery, aesthetic appeal, and the collective agreement that a thing is valuable, that's not stability. That's a bonfire waiting for someone to bring a match. But at this point in the story, the match hasn't been struck yet. Tulips are still ascending. They're rare, they're fashionable, they're respected. and the people trading them still think they're the smart ones. What they don't see, what no one sees, is just how quickly prestige can morph into profit chasing, and how a symbol of luxury can turn, almost overnight, into the hottest financial asset in Europe. That part comes next. It starts the way these things always do. Slowly, quietly, a few people making a little money off something fashionable, a few others noticing, prices nudging upward. Then, before anyone realizes what's happening, there's a line of people out the door all saying the same thing. I don't really get it, but it seems like a good investment. Welcome to the moment tulips stopped being flowers and started being financial instruments. After years of obsession among the elite, the demand for rare tulips had created something entirely new in Europe. A speculative market for plants. Not gardens, not farming, not agriculture in the traditional sense. Just tulip bulbs. Small, seasonal, soil-bound lumps of future color. At first, it was just private collectors trading amongst themselves. A few bulbs here, a few bulbs there. They'd swap specimens, compare streaks, debate over naming conventions. You know, rich person hobbies. But prices were creeping upward, not because the flowers were improving, but because the mystique was. More varieties, more catalog entries, more talk. Then came the merchants, always first to sniff out a trend. They saw what was happening and did what merchants do best, monetized it. Suddenly, it wasn't just noblemen and botanists dealing in tulips. It was tradesmen, shopkeepers, brokers, entire families entering the trade. And crucially, they weren't buying tulips to plant or admire anymore. They were buying to resell. The first real tulip trading hubs emerged in cities like Haarlem and Amsterdam. These weren't flower markets, they were organized exchanges. Not with stock tickers or ringing bells, but with pens, papers, ledgers, and groups of men arguing over prices while hunched around tables in candlelit rooms. Often taverns, because what better place to launch a speculative bubble than after 2 pints and a plate of smoked herring? At this point, we're still in the early 1630s. The Dutch economy is humming, credit is easy, wages are solid, and tulip prices are steadily rising. Not dramatically, just enough to get noticed. A few bulbs double in value over the course of a year. That's enough. People start treating bulbs like assets. Things you just don't own but hold, like real estate or gold. Something you could grow, not in your garden, but in your portfolio. And of course, because humans have the memory of a goldfish when it comes to speculative risk, people begin leveraging, borrowing money to buy bulbs, not because they love tulips, but because their neighbor's cousin made 4 times his money in 6 months, and you just know it's going to keep going. Why wouldn't it? Now let's talk about how this market actually worked. Because this wasn't a marketplace full of flowers. Most of the action was in tulip contracts. Written agreements to buy or sell a specific bulb at a specific price to be delivered at a future date. These were called wind handle or wind trade, because people were quite literally buying and selling air. You didn't need to have a flower. You didn't even need to have a bulb. You just needed the belief that the bulb existed would exist or might eventually exist. And you needed someone willing to buy that belief for more than you paid for it. It was an early version of a futures market. People were making promises to deliver bulbs they didn't have to people who didn't want them, who would then sell those promises to someone else who also didn't want them, but definitely thought the price would go up next week. No one was growing anything, no one was planting. They were flipping contracts like sneakers on eBay. Just a lot more parchment and quills involved. And the best part? There were no rules. None. No regulatory bodies, no enforcement, no oversight. You could write up a tulip deal on a napkin over a beer, and that counted. And if someone didn't follow through, good luck suing them. The entire thing was held together by social trust and collective greed. But even without regulation, the market grew fast and chaotically. Tulip prices rose week by week. More contracts were created. More people jumped in. Demand spiked, not for the flowers, but for the pieces of paper representing the flowers. It became a secondary market detached from any botanical reality. And the rarer the variety, the crazier the action. Semper Augustus, Viceroy. These weren't just flowers. They were brand names. Premium assets. Everyone wanted a slice, and the more expensive they got, the more people convinced themselves the price made sense. What started as a plant became a promise, a symbol, a bet. If you owned tulip contracts, you weren't just buying into the market. You were buying into a fantasy of infinite upside. A world where every contract was worth more tomorrow. And the only thing that mattered was getting in now, before the next fool paid more than you did. This was also the moment when the tulip trade left the confines of the merchant class and spread into the hands of everyday people. Artisans, shoemakers, brewers, servants, anyone with a few guilders to spare and a dream of early retirement via horticulture derivatives. It was a gold rush, but with dirt clumps. No one was asking if the bulbs were actually worth anything. No one cared. The only question anyone was asking was, how much can I sell it for next week? And like all bubbles, the media got involved. Pamphlets, broadsheets, gossip columns. Everyone was talking about the tulip market. Stories of overnight fortunes were repeated and exaggerated. The tone was always the same. Get in before it's too late. It was financial FOMO in printed form. People started showing up at the exchanges who had no idea how tulips worked. Didn't care about the flower. Didn't even care about the plant. They just wanted a piece of the action. The tulip was no longer a flower, it was a ticket to status, to wealth, to not being the poor idiot who missed the boat. And the more abstract the trade became, the more divorced from reality it grew. By late 1635, some bulbs were being resold 10 or 20 times in a single season, before they were even dug out of the ground. No one ever saw the bulb. No one even checked to see if it was healthy. The bulb was a placeholder, a unit, a token of speculation. This is what happens when you stop trading things of value and start trading the idea of value. It's the kind of logic that sounds smart in the moment and sounds completely insane once the market turns. But in 1635, the market hadn't turned. It was going vertical, and people were losing their minds. The fever had taken hold. By 1636, the Dutch tulip trade had officially stopped being a niche activity for rich guys with greenhouses and become something far more dangerous, accessible. It was no longer about botany. It wasn't even about status anymore. It was about money, fast money, and everyone wanted in. At this point, the tulip market was functioning more like a casino than anything remotely agricultural. It had become an ecosystem of speculation, spinning faster with every trade, dragging more people into the orbit with each price jump. What started in elite circles had trickled into the middle class, and from there into the streets. Everyone from skilled artisans to chimney sweeps was getting involved, and not just as buyers, as believers. The tipping point wasn't some official decree or formal deregulation. It was cultural. When you see your neighbor, a guy who makes barrels for a living, bragging about how he just made 6 months' wages flipping a flower bulb he'd never even touched, the rational response isn't to say, that seems sustainable. It's to ask where you can buy in. By now, tulips were being traded in taverns, on street corners, at public auctions. They were discussed in letters, overheard in bakeries, debated in barbershops. It had become normal, acceptable, even admirable to be involved in the tulip trade. Having a few bulb contracts in your ledger made you financially savvy. Not having them made you look naive. In Haarlem, one of the epicenters of the tulip frenzy, trading sessions became almost daily. They weren't hushed meetings between florists and scholars. They were semi-public gatherings, with people of all professions jostling to get a piece of the action. Beer was served, prices were shouted, bulbs were never seen. It was stock trading, 17th century style. Ink-stained fingers, cheap alcohol, and absolutely no oversight. The logic was airtight, as long as you didn't think about it too hard. Buy low, sell high. Everyone else is doing it. Prices only go up. If it worked for the guy who sharpens blades for a living, it can work for you. Why sit around and labor for a living when you can flip your way to fortune with something that lives in the dirt for 9 months of the year? There were countless stories of people making small fortunes, which is how every bubble survives in its early stages. The stories, the testimonies, the neighbor who made tenfold on a rare bulb, the cousin who traded a bulb for a cart, a cloak, and a full set of furniture. These stories traveled faster than reason. They drowned out caution. They made the whole thing feel inevitable. And the economy, conveniently, was doing well. Wages were stable, trade was booming. That gave people confidence, the false kind. The kind that makes you believe you can afford to take risks. The kind that whispers, put just a little more in. This could be your way out, your early retirement, your big leap forward. But what makes this moment so fascinating and so familiar is how completely it untethered tulips from reality. Nobody cared about the flower anymore, not its bloom time, not its soil needs, not even what it looked like. It could be striped, flamed, broken, or plain beige for all anyone cared. It didn't matter because the bulb wasn't being grown. It was being traded. Ownership of a tulip wasn't about having something. It was about the potential to offload that something to someone dumber, or more optimistic, or more desperate. The physical object was irrelevant. The value was entirely in its momentum. And people were taking bigger risks. They were borrowing money, selling possessions, taking out IOUs, using real assets, land, livestock, savings, to acquire imaginary ones. All in the belief that the price tomorrow would be higher than the price today. And for a time it was. Some contracts were flipped 2, 3, 10 times before a single bulb was ever dug up. There were reports of bulbs being resold dozens of times before anyone actually expected delivery. A handful of traders were getting rich off these swaps, buying contracts in one town, selling them in another, skimming profit off of the difference like proto-day traders with wooden shoes and terrible hygiene. It wasn't just individual gamblers anymore. Groups of people started pooling money to speculate together. Tulip syndicates, collaborative gambling rings for flowers. Think investment clubs, but dumber. If you couldn't afford a full bulb, you could buy a share of one. Congratulations, you're now the proud 1/16th owner of a future potential Semper Augustus. Hope it doesn't rot in storage. There were even informal derivatives, side bets on side bets, promises to deliver a bulb at a certain price or pay a penalty if you couldn't. All enforceable by nothing but social pressure and a shared illusion that this was legitimate commerce. But these promises began to outnumber the actual bulbs by orders of magnitude. There were more papered tulips than actual tulips, and yet prices kept climbing. The prices became absurd. A single bulb of a rare variety could cost more than a skilled laborer earned in 10 years. Some were going for 10 times the annual income of a master carpenter. And people were paying. Not just speculators, but regular folks who'd mortgaged futures they didn't understand for assets they couldn't see in a market they could not control. All of this was made worse by one core assumption, that tulips were different, that this wasn't like other fads or manias. Tulips had value. Tulips had rarity. Tulips had meaning. People rationalized the prices with elaborate arguments, scarcity, fashion, economic sophistication, global demand. And those arguments didn't sound crazy because everyone else believed them too. And that's the most dangerous part of any bubble, when irrational behavior becomes normalized. When a bad idea doesn't just go unchallenged, it becomes the new standard. In 1636, owning tulip futures didn't make you a gambler. It made you smart. It meant you were paying attention. It meant you had your ear to the ground. That you were clever, financially literate, upwardly mobile. All of which made the crash, when it came, not just a financial event, but a psychological one. It happened fast. That's the thing about bubbles. They inflate over months, sometimes years, slowly, steadily, with a mix of greed, hype, and mutual delusion. But they don't deflate gently. They pop loudly, and everyone scrambles at once to pretend they saw it coming. By early 1637, tulip prices had reached heights so ridiculous they could only be described with two words: completely unsustainable. A single Semper Augustus bulb was worth thousands of guilders. Contracts were changing hands dozens of times before a flower had even been planted, and entire classes of people had become financially entangled in a market that was now held together by hope, hearsay, and maybe 3 actual tulips. And then it stopped. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't a war. It wasn't even a major event. The pop came in the form of a single failed auction. One routine tulip sale, a batch of bulbs offered in Harlem, failed to attract buyers. The prices didn't meet expectations. A few people hesitated, others backed out, and suddenly, the room full of confident speculators looked a little less confident. Because in a bubble, confidence isn't just a nice to have, it is the market. Prices aren't based on utility or fundamentals. They're based on the shared belief that the price tomorrow will be higher than the price today. So when that belief wobbles, the entire structure collapses. News of the failed auction spread quickly. In towns across the Netherlands, other auctions stumbled. Buyers started missing appointments. Brokers began to panic. Sellers who'd been fielding offers just days earlier couldn't get a single bid. The crash was on. Prices fell fast. Tulip varieties that had been worth hundreds of guilders were now worth 50, then 20, then less than the cost of a dinner. Within weeks, some bulbs couldn't be sold at all. The market that had once made people rich overnight couldn't find anyone willing to take on a bulb at any price. And here's where the real damage began. The contracts. Remember, most people weren't trading physical bulbs, they were trading paper promises, agreements to buy bulbs in the future at set prices. So when the prices collapsed, those agreements became financial landmines. Buyers couldn't afford to honor them, sellers couldn't enforce them, and thousands of people suddenly realized they were on the hook for assets that no longer had value. The courts were flooded. Lawsuits flew. Everyone blamed someone else. The sellers for being greedy, the buyers for being stupid, the brokers for feeding the frenzy, the government for doing nothing. In reality, it was all of them, collectively building and maintaining a fantasy that collapsed the moment someone asked, "What happens if this doesn't go up forever?" The Dutch authorities, watching the mess unfold, tried to intervene. They proposed a compromise. Contracts could be canceled if the buyer paid a cancellation fee, around 3.5% of the original price. It was essentially a mercy exit clause, a way for people to admit they'd been idiots without going completely bankrupt. But no one liked it. Buyers didn't want to pay for losses. Sellers didn't want to eat the difference. The legal status of tulip contracts was murky, so some courts refused to enforce them. Others tried, but without consistency. The The result was chaos. People stopped paying. The market froze, and the entire tulip trade, once a proud and prestigious niche of horticulture and high society, became a nationwide embarrassment. And yet, despite all the drama, the crash didn't destroy the Dutch economy. That's one of the most misunderstood parts of Tulip Mania. It didn't tank the banks. It didn't cause a recession. It wasn't a financial apocalypse. Most of the damage was limited to individuals, particularly those who had bet big, borrowed money, or sold off real assets to buy in. The broader economy kept chugging. Trade continued. The Dutch Republic didn't fall. It turns out when you isolate your economic madness to flower bulbs, the system can actually survive the fallout. But what did collapse was the illusion, the belief that prices reflected real value, that a tulip was worth a house. That paper promises built on future price increases were just as good as cash. That infinite growth was possible in a finite market driven by seasonal plants. And what remained, once the dust settled, was the shame. Because how do you explain to your family that you lost their inheritance trading imaginary flowers? How do you justify taking out a loan to buy a bulb that now won't cover the cost of lunch? For many, the crash wasn't just financial, it was social. People who had bragged for months about their tulip investments now had to pretend it had all been a misunderstanding, a fluke, an isolated incident. Tulip Mania became a dirty phrase. The people who had fed it, the traders, the middle-class buyers, the profiteers, faded into the background. The paintings stopped. The catalogs disappeared. The market closed. And tulips went back to being what they had always been before all this. Flowers. Nice to look at. Totally incapable of generating compound returns. But the story didn't end there. In the years that followed, writers, philosophers, and economists would look back on Tulip Mania as the ultimate cautionary tale. Not because the crash was the biggest, it wasn't. Not because it destroyed a nation, it didn't. But because it was so absurdly preventable. It had all the warning signs, the skyrocketing prices, the paper speculation, the herd behavior, the contagious optimism, the fundamental disconnect between price and value. And still, nobody hit the brakes. Because no one ever thinks they're in a bubble until it bursts. Tulip Mania became a symbol, a reference point, a metaphor for collective delusion. And every time another speculative frenzy has come along, from South Sea stock to tech startups to crypto, someone inevitably digs up the story of the Dutch and their extremely expensive gardening mistake. And they laugh. And then they go invest in the next bubble. Because if there's one thing history proves beyond all doubt, it's that we don't learn from it. We just change the asset class.